Ladies and gentlemen, it's my pleasure to welcome you to this session of the Democratizing Evidence in Education, the search for balance between inclusivity and expertise. My name's Jim Kohlmoos, and I am going to serve as your moderator today. I want to express a deep appreciation to SREE, who has been able to pivot and create these virtual sessions for us to participate in all through the summer and into the fall. And thank you so much to SREE. And thank you to all of you for joining us for this, which should be an interesting and provocative time together. I want to let you know that we're going to do 3 different things today. In terms of looking at what democratizing evidence is, some of the inherent tensions that emerge from this concept of democratizing evidence. And we're going to turn to you about midway through to really take a look at these tensions and get your ideas that you can generate during the session. Protocols, everybody, if you don't mind putting yourself on mute. If you have questions, you can put them into the chat room. We'll try to get to them at certain times. We're going to have breakout rooms about midway through. And let's see, having a little glitch here with the slideshow. And there's a special thing that we're going to do that we're going to ask you to do. And that is, we have an ideas form, and we'll put it into the chat box too, but you might want to take down that, that URL, because you're going to be filling out a form within your breakout rooms that will allow you to present your ideas and share some of the strategies that you're thinking about doing. Let me go back here. There are some really interesting an interesting circuitous route of how we got here with democratizing evidence. And the person that served as the real catalyst for this effort is Vivian Tseng of the W.T. Grant Foundation. I'm going to call upon Vivian now to take us through the background and how it led into the development of a statement of principles that we're going to be delving into in just a little while. Vivian.
Thanks so much, Jim, and thank you everyone for joining us for what I think is a really important conversation. I'm happy to give you a little bit of background on how this idea and set of conversations began, and I'm really looking forward to welcoming you all of you into this broader set of very important conversations. I would say for myself and some of my colleagues, this idea of democratizing evidence really came to a head for us about 5 years ago. At the time, many of us were really concerned about the way in which evidence was being used in the US education system. You know, we have been coming off of 20 years, I would say, of the What Works agenda as a framework and a set of ideas for what it takes for evidence to be used in practice. And while there have been tremendous achievements in this under the What Works agenda, it also came with some costs. For many folks, especially at the practitioner level and the local level, it felt like there were federal policymakers kind of stationed far away from schools and classrooms that were trying to leverage evidence to get them to adopt different kinds of programs and practices at their local level. And there was a lot of frustration that the evidence that was available was not always relevant to their local context. It didn't fit what they were able to afford, what their staff were able to implement. There were just a lot of concerns about that. And around about the same time, you had a lot going on around teacher policy. And so similar conversations about the use of data and evidence to shape decisions about teachers, hiring, firing, salaries, et cetera, et cetera. And again, it created this narrative of high-level decision makers, policy makers that were leveraging data and evidence to make decisions about teachers, but without a lot of involvement of teachers themselves. And as we started to think about this in a broader context, of course, this isn't just the last 20 years, right? If we think back much further, there's been a long history, a long set of complaints about research being done on schools, on students, on teachers, but it's what people have called drive-by research. It's done and it's out, and it hasn't really contributed back much to the schools, the teachers, and the parents, kids who participated. And in essence, what we started to think about is the fact that our evidence system, our production of evidence, our ways of using evidence didn't really embody democratic principles. The democratic principles, which we say we so value in other parts of our society, have not been core to the ways in which we've structured evidence production and use. So if you think about research agendas, who gets to set research agendas? Researchers. Around evaluation research has often been policymakers. It's very rarely centered practitioners themselves as driving what an evaluation or improvement agenda would look like, to drive what a data system would look like. It certainly has not put communities, students, parents, the folks who are most affected by our education system at the center of defining evidence agendas or at the center of defining how evidence will be used. And so this work really just began with this very simple idea of how can we apply democratic principles to thinking about our evidence work, both on the production side and on the use side. And as our ideas evolved, we started out thinking a lot about practitioners, about communities, about, what are their roles in this system. But of course, we also had to think about some of the sharp, persistent, pervasive inequalities in our society, because those are also cleavages that affect our evidence system. So when we start to think about, yes, researchers, generally speaking, get to set research agendas, or the research community does, or certain members of the research community do, and we start to break that down in terms of racial, ethnic group, in terms of class, we start to think about who is producing and leveraging the research on Black and Brown communities. Who is speaking out and for low-income students and their families? Who's leveraging that research? Who has the power to wield that evidence? And whose research is heard? And so we start to see, when we start to look through the prisms of racism, of classism, of xenophobia, of these things that so plague all other elements of our society, we see that they also plague the evidence system in our society, both on the evidence production side and on the evidence use side. And so again, it's just challenging. I think this is just a set of conversations to challenge us to think about how do we better align our evidence work and our evidence systems with democratic principles and some of the broader values I think that many of us share and that we're so proud of in this country. And so coming out of just some of those ideas and conversations, it's been a wonderful and engaging time. I was very fortunate to be able to write a chapter laying out some initial ideas with Esther Quintero of the Shanker Institute and with Steve Fleischman, who was then with Education Northwest, but who is now an independent consultant. And from there, the William T. Grant Foundation, we convened a meeting. We brought together a much broader, diverse group of people just to further explore these ideas and say, do they have any value? Do they have any resonance? And we brought together practitioners, researchers, civil rights groups, and funders and policymakers, again, just to start thinking through these issues. And there was a moment in that meeting where Steve Fleischman said, why don't we put together a statement of principles? Let's start thinking this through together and getting something down on paper. And that was where it really took off, I think. A group of people just volunteered at the meeting and got together to pull together what would be a set of guiding principles for this work. And so I'm happy to share them with you. And again, I hope we can think about these as conversation starters. None of this stuff is set in stone. These are ways that we as a community have begun to think about them. And really, I hope they're more for provoking deeper thought. So Jim, do you want me to walk through them now, or is there a slide you want to show?
Yeah, why don't you, I'll put the slide up and then you can talk through them very quickly.
Okay, great. So again, a group of volunteers from that first meeting came together and developed this set of 4 guiding principles, which you can find on the website, which is located on the bottom of the slide. The first is a focus on inclusive engagement and thinking about at the front end, as we're defining agendas, that there should be a diverse group of stakeholders and it should be inclusive and there should be authentic engagement of people in different roles. So whether they are educators, researchers, families, policymakers, and defining what research needs to be done, how is it going to be used. And then we also need to think about these things that cleave our society around race and class as well. Number 2 is we encourage folks to think about participation across the research process. I've spent a lot of time talking about the front end because too often we ignore the very, very front end, which is setting the research agenda in the first place, defining what it is that needs to be researched and from whose perspective it needs to be researched. But of course, I think it's worth consideration along the whole spectrum of the research process and thinking about the conduct of research, interpreting findings. Findings never speak for themselves. Who gets to be at the table to figure out what these research findings mean and what they suggest for policy change or practice change. So we should think about that whole spectrum. I'm not saying we have to act on all of it at all times, but we should at least be cognizant of it. And then when it does come to research agendas, they should be responsive to the really high priority problems of practice and policy, in our view, so that they meet our equity goals, so that all students can benefit and succeed from our educational system. And then lastly, a principle around responsible evidence production and use. And this is the idea that, there has to be a general respect for the scientific process, the scientific inquiry, what it has to offer. But that's also balanced with this recognition that science is not going to solve the problems of our society on its own. It's a very important place. But values, community values, the ways we prioritize the work that needs to be done and think about different kinds of solutions, that is always going to have a seat at the table in policy decision making. And so also a respect and understanding for that. So while we're thinking about evidence production and use, understanding both the full weight of what it contributes, but also understanding that it will never be sufficient in and of itself. Okay, Jim, I'm turning it over to you.
Vivian, thank you so much. And that's a terrific overview. And those 4 principles are pretty broad. And so what we did is had different stakeholder groups get together and think more strategically about what these principles mean. And we formed a stakeholder group composed of researchers, and Steve Fleischman, heard his name already dropped once by Vivian, as one of the lead thinkers in this effort from the get-go. And Steve is going to take us through the 4 basic strategies that the researcher stakeholder group came up with. Steve.
Yeah, thanks, Jim, and thanks, Vivian, for kicking us off. And hi, everybody. Really glad to be joining you for this conversation. as Jim said, we laid out some strategies, which are suggestions for researchers to consider. And we believe that the 4 strategies we identified not only make the process more democratic, but they also improve the research because they consider the most important factors that might come from different perspectives. And it also helps to ensure some relevance, and it increases the likelihood that findings will be used in policy and practice. So let me walk you through those 4 suggestions, strategies, and then tell you why each of them matter. So the first is cultivate equitable partnerships with stakeholders, especially those groups that will be affected by the research, and do this from the outset. So this is following on some of what Vivian already said. And this is why this matters. It's because mutualistic partnerships that attend to equity can ensure that questions address relevant issues for the groups that we are trying to serve through our work. And it also improves the likelihood that that research will be actually put to use. The second is to report findings free of jargon and that are easily accessible. I think this is one that researchers discuss a lot and think about a lot. And all of these implementation strategies, I should say, are maybe things that you're doing already. So we're just putting them in one place as reminders for some of you and as perhaps new ideas. But the reason that reporting free of jargon and easily accessible research is simply that to have impact, you must be understood. To mobilize evidence, it has to be understood by people who are in the position to take action. The third is public discourse, participation in public discussion. And the strategies here suggest pursuing alternative outreach channels beyond peer-reviewed journals or research conferences, looking for open source journals, non-expert conferences, writing blog posts, op-eds, attending school board meetings, attending community meetings to make research more available. And here the reason it matters is the dictum that if you want to be heard, you need to engage in new settings. The current settings for most research are very constrained, and we're speaking to each other as researchers. But again, to mobilize the evidence, we need to reach out further. We need to participate in public discourse. And then finally, we suggest strategies. All of these are on the website. And you see the website link at the bottom of each one of the pages of this presentation. We need to think about how to change institutional cultures, incentives, and training opportunities so more people can be engaged in the kind and the type of research that we envision. It's hard and it's a little non-traditional to do this kind of work, so it's really important, and I'm really pleased that folks from the research community and from the practice community are on this on this webinar, this meeting, so we can think about this together. I want to just say that I want to encourage you to consider reading the full statement that we made, and also to sign on to the statement of principles. And in closing, I just want to say that there's a lot of really interesting work that's taking place right now that's suggesting ways that we can be much more democratic in our research. And I just want to call your attention to one, which is Chicago Beyond's Why Am I Always Being Researched? If you go to our website and look at the resources, you'll see that there's a link to it there. And one of the things that they talk about is that, and Vivian already spoke about this, is that inequities are rooted in unequal power arrangements. And often our research tends to replicate that. So we have to seek new ways of having new relationships. And I love that they have a section specifically for researchers. It starts on page 60. So I'm going to let you, when you look at it, look at that. And they start with this statement: because evidence truly matters, we must care how it is made. So with that, I want to now turn to Ilene, who's going to speak about recommendations and resources for philanthropy.
Thanks so much, Steve. And I think throughout this conversation, you're going to hear a lot of echoes, because we all together are figuring out how can we, from our various vantage points, help contribute to this effort to democratize the use of evidence in education. And I am just thrilled that there's so many people who are joining this discussion, because it will take so many of us from our different perspectives and positions in order to advance democratization. And before I turn to the strategies, I want to highlight that resources section on the website. Now, when we compiled all the strategies, we said, well, let's also ask the question, what does this look like, and what are some of the guides and materials to help us put some of these ideas, which sometimes can seem abstract, into practice? And the resource section currently has information geared to and from grant makers. A lot of this, though, will have value to folks who are practitioners and researchers and community-based. And the resources right now are really, I think, nicely curated to think about, for grant makers initially, how do we engage in our own learning, and how do we assess our own internal processes around decision-making and grant-making to be more democratic in the way that we work. And then there are also resources around communications and some guides about how do we fund infrastructure that's going to help expand access, inclusion, and transparency in evidence creation and use. And I think philanthropy is in a really unique position here. We have a lot of opportunity to be innovative, to be inclusive, and we have tremendous responsibility in doing that. And in doing so, and recognizing our position as funders, need to bring a sense of humility to all of this. And the strategies, I'll dive into those now, which were written by a group of folks working in philanthropy, for philanthropy. Start where the strategies for all groups start: engagement. We have to repeatedly ask the questions: who is research benefiting? Who's being engaged? How are people and their experiences showing up? And as funders, we can influence what research gets attention, whose voices are heard, and we must keep a laser focus on racial equity and inclusion in all of this to make sure that communities of color and those who are often underrepresented are represented in the research that we're supporting. Philanthropy can also invest in breaking down some of the systemic barriers that are often preventing the authentic stakeholder engagement. And examples, which I'm sure many of you engage with quite a bit, are some of the participatory research, helping young people to play leading roles in research about their own educational experiences, using participatory grant-making processes. And I also highly recommend that Chicago Beyond report. Really does such a nice job of giving voice to both the power dynamic that often exists when you bring together researchers and community-based organizations and practitioners and community members and young people. And what I really think is powerful about it is offering steps to help navigate those dynamics and get to authentic knowledge and research and understanding. A third strategy is around how do we communicate? How do we foster robust dialogue around the evidence that's created. We know, if the research isn't clear, accessible, and transparent, it's not going to do much good. And so those of us in a funding position can not only help to support the research itself, but support work to make that communication even sharper and stronger and more useful. And those website resources include a lot of really great examples, some creative research products like sidewalk science fairs to engage community members in looking at data and findings, wearable data that people can put on t-shirts. There's some really good resources in there with heat maps and a lot of other data visual techniques. So recommend you taking a look at that. And as I noted in talking about engagement, foundations play a really important role in making sure that the needs and strengths of communities of color are reflected in research and evidence. And at the NAK Foundation, where we have a deep commitment to doing that, we internally use a 7-step guide in our work, guiding our own practice as well as with partners and grantees. And that some of those steps include developing some shared equity principles, disaggregating data, conducting root cause analyses, and I think really critically to use an asset-based frame rather than a deficit-based frame when we talk about our work and talk about what the data is showing us. And then finally, philanthropy can play an important role in making the case for the value of evidence and what is valued as evidence, and in promoting effective education and for using that evidence for the public good. So I think this is work that we all have to do in partnership, and appreciate and look forward to hearing what all of you have to say in response to what we're sharing today. And also would invite you, in addition to signing on to this set of principles, if it resonates with you, to also share with us additional resources that we should be highlighting on this website. We hope that this can be a go-to place for people who are committed to democratizing the use of evidence. Thanks. And now I want to turn to Esther, who will talk about strategies that have been developed for and by practitioners.
Hello, everybody. I was waiting there for a second because I wasn't sure if I needed to unmute myself. Welcome, everybody. As Ilene said, and you probably got from what we shared up to this point, there's a lot of similarities in the strategies that we develop because, it's interrelated. We work on them together and with the same sort of goals in mind. So what I thought I'd do with sort of the strategies pertaining educators is think about how they're threaded together. What are common themes in those 4 different strategies, because I think they are deeply related, and sometimes even for us it was kind of hard to kind of separate one from the other, even separate the the grant maker strategy from the educator strategy and so on. So maybe as going last, I'm going to take the liberty to sort of provide a kind of way of thinking about the educator strategy that is interrelated. So when we think, and this is something that Vivian started with, I think when we think about how research and educators are related, the typical use that comes to mind is, researchers produce knowledge, and in an ideal world, educators take that knowledge and apply it to the classroom, to their practice, to their school organization. And I would argue that is a valid link between educators and research, but it's not the only link. And I think that to view it as the only link is problematic. It's problematic for things that we've already said here, you know, issues of relevance of research and issues of, you know, how educators are perceiving the relationship with research. I mean, so what I would like to argue is let's think about this relationship between practitioners and research in broader ways that are more expansive. And I'd like to propose two approaches that, you know, in one way or another have been talked about here. One is, you know, when you talk to teachers, they already think they do research. You know, their job is to observe students, collect data on how they're doing, and then apply that knowledge, you know, collected in more systematic ways, in less systematic ways. We can argue about the differences, but in their mind, they are using this data to adapt their instruction to their students. So I think acknowledging that part of being a teacher involves some kind of research is important to engage this group, to recognize that that is part of what they do. Teachers produce innovations. Innovations that, the problem that we have is that academics have a way of disseminating their work, and it's very well developed. You know, there are journals, there are processes, peer review. There's no such thing for teachers. You know, teachers don't have a way of sharing their work and innovation and build the knowledge base of their field. So, but I think we need to recognize that they already do those things. I have a personal example to share. I mean, my father is a school psychologist in Spain, where I'm from. And, you know, he developed this method for struggling readers, and he had no support to kind of do anything with it. He did it on a dime. He looked for collaborations with universities, but, you know, these things take effort. And, you know, how can we build a system that better support educators who are in those positions, who have those inclinations, you know, and I'm sure there are many. And the third way of thinking about educators, the relationship between educators and research, is as contributors to research. And not, you know, some of you have already said, you know, that who sets the research agenda? It's typically researchers, it's typically policymakers, and very rarely is it teachers. And so I think democratizing the evidence movement requires that educators participate in those phases of the research process, you know, asking the questions, what are the knowledge needs of the field? And, you know, and also, frankly, collaborate with researchers in theory building, in empirical projects. You know, they know the context of their schools and their classroom better than the researchers, and researchers have blind spots that can be, you know, that can be complemented by work with educators. So, and I think the reason why, part of the reason why we forget about these ways that researchers and practitioners and research are connected is because we still need to fully recognize teacher expertise and teacher knowledge. And that is something that becomes very salient when you talk to educators. I'm not an educator myself, but I try to surround myself with educators to be able to be a voice for them. And that comes through very clearly. There's a power differential between researchers and teachers. And so part of democratizing this movement is for us to think about how we can flip that and how we can be more equal partners in this conversation, where teachers feel that they can contribute, their views are valued, their contributions and their expertise is valued. So the last point I wanted to make is about communities. And as Vivian and others have said, you know, it's important to include the voices of communities, because in decision making, while evidence is very central and important, is not the only factor. We think that if we only rely on evidence, then it's when we start, having situations where evidence is weaponized, because it threatens what people believe. And I think what people believe and the values that they should have their own rightful place, and then be informed, be shaped, by the evidence. So for us, bringing community into this conversation is one way of acknowledging that those values are also central in decision making as evidence is. And with that, I think I'm supposed to give you Jim.
Yes, Esther, thank you.
Uh-huh.
And we had, with the practitioners, educator, stakeholder group, we really had some fascinating and far-reaching conversations. Really appreciate Esther's leadership in pulling together some of the ideas that you can see in the strategies. This idea of democratizing evidence certainly brings up a lot of questions, and we started to think about them in terms of tensions, inherent tensions. And someone who really has done a lot of thinking on this topic and is also the chairperson of SREE is Lashawn Richburg-Hayes. And I'm going to call upon her to talk a little bit about the different tensions that emerge from this idea of democratizing evidence. And then we'll move into breakout groups where you'll have an opportunity to chat about all this with colleagues. Lashawn.
Thank you, Jim. So thank you everyone for joining. It's really great to see so many people staying on the line for this really important conversation. As a Black woman, a woman of color who has gone through academia, I'm an economist by training. Lack of representation is not new to me. And unfortunately, it's a situation that I've found myself in quite a bit. And understanding the power dynamics from both ends of the spectrum is something that I have thought about for quite some time. And I think we're at a moment in our history, unfortunately, given the travesty of George Floyd, to think really and critically about what role each of us plays professionally and individually in keeping a system moving on the same track it has been moving, or moving very incrementally from it. And as researchers, we may question what our roles are, but I think this conversation gives us some starting points to continue, or if not, continue to start to really question how we're going about our research and what we can do differently. So some of the tensions that are involved in this has already been discussed, but I just want to highlight a few aspects to pinpoint what I mean when I say we can each do something now. So take the tension between exclusivity, expertise, and inclusivity. So that was talked about from a number of speakers. As researchers, we often develop our research agenda on the basis of what we think is important, or what we think the field needs or practitioners need, not necessarily collaborating with practitioners and not necessarily collaborating with the recipients of that intervention or research study. This is important, as Vivian mentioned, not only from the start to make sure that we're working on things that matter, that will be used and can be used and adapted, but also it's important before the research is published. I'll give you a personal experience that I've had. I would like to think of myself as being conscious, but I am a person and prone to errors. I had shared a draft of some impact tables with some practitioners, and these impact tables were looked at by a number of colleagues. It took a student to ask, why are you framing this outcome in this way? Why are you framing this outcome as the proportion of students who received a D or an F, as opposed to the proportion of students who received an A or a B or higher. And it was a very fair question because that is just the dichotomy, and it could have been phrased either way. Because the population of interest were population of male students of color, this framing matters. It's a matter of a deficit framing versus a strengths-based framing because the impact estimate is exactly the same. It's just flipped. We all know this, right? My point is that those tables went through 30 pairs of eyes before it met that student. And we can all say that, Lashawn, you and your team have failed. And I'm okay with taking that. But I would push back and say, when you look at the research, you look at what's published, you look at peer-reviewed papers, I can and you can point out deficit language throughout. And those papers have been reviewed, they have been presented, they have been through a number of segments to think about quality. But what we're not necessarily thinking about is the perspective of the folks who can actually use this and the perspectives of the folks that it affects. And so this goes back to power and who's in power and the power of our presence, the power of our defining variables. In my particular case, there was an analyst who defined those variables. I was focused on some other issues. Nonetheless, there are decisions being made at all levels in our research that are pertinent. Another tension that comes through when you start to think about this is how are places being recruited to participate in our studies? There's an inherent conflict between who's coming with the funding and asking you to participate versus places that want to work with researchers to understand how to improve or whether something is efficacious or not. Funding plays a huge role in this. What can you get funding for to study, who will fund it, and whether that funding will cover all aspects of what you as a researcher deems important, as well as the practitioners and stakeholders deem important. And here I would also say that a tension is between the untrained and the trained. So as Esther mentioned, we often don't see practitioners as researchers or as colleagues. They may not be as steeped in methods that as we are, or understand the nuance of decisions as we do. Nonetheless, they have a broad swath of information and context that we do not have, that we do not understand, and that could change the way that we interpret or make recommendations had we been privy of them. So pulling in that voice and those perspectives and being respectful of it is something that we can do a bit better. And I would argue we can do that in the most rigorous methodological studies. And I feel like I can say this having worked for MDRC for 16 years and doing RCTs for all of that time. There were many decisions in many places for which decision-making like this comes into play that's at the behest of the research team to decide. So as we go into our breakout groups, I would challenge everyone to think about these tensions, tensions between inclusivity and expertise, between partnership and independence, between who's recruiting a program versus the program seeking an evaluator, tensions between what gets funded versus what we would like to have funded, and who's available to do that. And one last thought of attention I'd leave you with is efficiency versus effectiveness. We're often thinking about the efficiency of going through an evaluation study, doing it at low cost, fast, expeditious to get it into the field, et cetera. But getting feedback takes time. Incorporating feedback takes time. That may mean that a project takes a little bit more time to start up in the beginning because the design that was envisioned is no longer appropriate from a stakeholder's perspective. Or incorporating an assets-based perspective takes a little more resources to get the voices at the table than would otherwise happen. And I would argue that this is a challenge that we all face, not just researchers, but funders as well. And having us push back on the funding only geared to support the impact study and not the qualitative study is something that we can do collectively.
Okay, Lashawn, thank you so much. And now we're getting ready to go into the breakout rooms. I would like to suggest again, I put it in the chat box, the form, the ideas form for you to access and to complete during the breakout sessions, and then you'll be sharing with your breakout colleagues. Don't go away, because this is the place where you really get to grapple with some of the issues. We're going to go into breakout groups. We'll spend about 20 minutes in these groups. You have a chance to fill out the form first on your own and then discuss them. And each group has a facilitator who will identify themselves when you get into the room. So Jess, take it away. Let's go to the breakout rooms. I think most everybody's back. And we're going to conclude here with a quick whip around to each of the facilitators to report back what happened in your session. But I do want to, and I also want to ask everybody to be sure and click submit on that ideas form that you filled out. And we're starting to get some results here that I will show you. But why don't we start off with Paula? What happened? One big idea.
Sure. So we actually two kind of themes popped out from our conversation. So one was the first tension that Lashawn identified, inclusivity versus expertise, as that being a quite significant tension. However, maybe because I was in the group and I somehow like put it in their minds, but RPPs being a potential solution to attack that tension, because they really do challenge that gap between education, research, and practice. And so that's one potential solution. The other kind of topic that we settled on a little bit was the importance of funding, and how Ruben, for example, in our group mentioned that if we can change the funding structures, then that is a kind of would make a huge difference in realizing changes along the other tensions. So if there's only one tension to pick, perhaps changing the rules of the game can then influence how the other tensions may still be affected.
Great. All right, thank you. And Paula, RPP, for those of you that don't know, it's Research Practice Partnership, and Paula is the National Director of the National Network of Education Research Practice Partnerships. We appreciate that she jumped in to help facilitate this. Why don't we go to Ilene?
Sure, we had a great discussion, much too short, and a few themes came up. One was this question of different people placing different values on particular types of evidence. So for example, the type of evidence that might be valued by a teacher practitioner versus an economist may be quite different. And how do you navigate that tension? And sometimes when those come together, there are tensions that are created. We also talked about, as Paula, your group did, this tension around fundability and aspirations. And Charlie shared that the many years of research about low-income parents and immigrant families that are so often framed with deficit or not getting to some of the root causes of, so, you know, why, he gave as an example, why parents might not be coming to back to school nights or coming to schools. There's more underneath that, and we need to do the kind of and fund the kind of research and evidence building that helps us understand what's really going on, and that leadership is key. And we didn't have a chance to delve into that. I think leadership at so many levels, as we're seeing right now across the country, but even if these 44 people on this conversation can go out and wave the banner and be the voice for this democratizing, how powerful that can be.
That is excellent. And I will say that on the response forms that inclusivity versus expertise is the #1 challenge, as you've identified. But the second one is fundability versus aspirations. So that's really important. I'm feeling a little bit like Judy Woodruff, where she has to say, we could carry on this conversation for a long time, but we only have just a few minutes left. So in a very quick nutshell, Steve, do you want to share what happened in yours?
Sure, thanks, Jim. The two issue areas, the two tensions you just mentioned are the two tensions we discussed. There was a really strong endorsement for taking an asset-based view in conducting the research, which I think goes to those fundamental democratic principles of respect for every human being, and kind of the dignity that underlies the work that we're doing and the aspirations for the work that we're doing. And on the inclusivity part, there were some, Karen provided some really interesting examples of early engagement of people in the research process as a way to address that tension.
Great. Esther, do you have 1 minute?
I can't do 1 minute, Jim. I'm just kidding. We didn't have enough time. It was a great conversation, and I wish I could have done more. Two ideas, inclusivity and expertise was talked about in my group. A couple of other very interesting and related thoughts. One, if we are serious about this tension, we need to define expertise. You know, there are many kinds of expertise. What do we mean by each kind? How each is important? Even, do we want to redefine expertise? Is the most expert the person who has the most methodological sophistication, or the one who has the most experience in a classroom? You know, those are questions that came up. And then, frankly, our culture, some people in my group were not from the US, and they talked a little bit about different approaches to research, you know, and the idea that, you know, in other places, the view of research as serving the common good is not just my research questions for my research, you know, interests, but it's more about, you know, how can this knowledge that I produce serve other people? And I thought that was quite a powerful idea that is at the core of much of what we're talking about here.
That question about what is expertise is a huge question. And I know that we even debated it when we first came up with this idea for the session. So it carries on, and I think we should probe it more deeply. Lashawn.
So we had an excellent discussion. I would say that it focused around inclusivity and expertise as well. We talked a lot about the students and the research around students, getting to the folks that can use it the most, and actually incorporating feedback from those students. So that tension between who is involved and what research questions are being asked and answered, and whether they're engaging the broader community. Particularly that we had a little bit of discussion of the Ivy Tower phenomenon, where you're just focused on within the Ivy Tower and not the surrounding community.
Great, excellent. And last but not least, we end with the person that we began with, Vivian.
Well, we had a very practical, I thought, really interesting conversation, and just thinking about talk time. That it's very easy to think, let's bring everyone together, research practice partnerships, get everyone in the same room. But if you actually assess talk time and who spends the most time talking, researchers often spend the most time talking. And then if they're different groups of practitioners, maybe the district leaders spend the next most amount of time, and then teachers the least. And so that is a reflection of who has power and who has the ability to contribute in deliberations, whether it's about a research agenda, making sense of the findings, or anything else. And so we talked very practically about protocols and ways of structuring conversations to ensure that there is more equitable participation that's happening. And that part of the goal is to create norms of interaction that can mitigate against power hierarchies. You can't eliminate them, but if we recognize them going in, there are things, very practical things we can do to mitigate their effects.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, we've gone a little bit over time, so we apologize for that. Just want to thank you so much for participating in this session. May it be the first of many more conversations about democratizing evidence. And thank you so much to our panel and to SREE for allowing us to put on this really interesting conversation. So stay in touch, folks, and we will hopefully see you again soon. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.